Now we turn to the wounded parts. Entire books could be written about them, and still we would only scratch the surface. For the sake of clarity and practicality, I'll offer a condensed view while honoring their complexity. You'll have plenty of room to explore them further as your work deepens. Exiles typically show up in three rough developmental layers: teenage, child, and baby-like parts. These structures form naturally through development. Just as the adolescent body emerges biologically, the teenage psychic structure seems to arise organically, often pushing back against internal systems that have developed up to that point, with the aim of protecting autonomy. These parts are not wounded by nature, rather, they become wounded through the circumstances, interactions, and unmet needs. Importantly, trauma or overt abuse isn't always required. Sometimes even subtle forms of misattunement, like prolonged absence of adequate mirroring, where the child could be truly seen, are enough to injure a child's internal sense of self. A simple atmosphere with no abuse whatsoever, but where genuine connection was missing, can still leave a child feeling lost. A child may become disconnected, lethargic, or emotionally frozen, and that disconnection can quietly follow them into adulthood. Sometimes, exiles show up distinctly. Other times, they're nested, like babushka dolls. A teenager leads to a child, and the child leads to a proverbial baby part. Each has its own qualities, needs, and burdens. But you can also meet any part on its own. Sometimes there may be several childlike parts appearing as separate entities. A child may appear happy, only for us to later discover that behind the happiness was a cover for deep pain. They can also show up in states of extreme entitlement, demanding others adapt to them or give them what they want. Essentially, you can find them in any state you might see in children or adolescents. You'll find them in the exact position where they were left, with all the emotions, beliefs, and needs they carried. It's as if they have a life of their own, and if they don't receive the treatment they need, recovery is almost impossible. Exiles can carry virtually every kind of emotional pain imaginable. Because of this, they might appear as schema therapy describes. They carry schemas related to the frustration of core basic needs, such as emotional deprivation, defectiveness, shame, worthlessness, failure, abandonment, mistrust, abuse, dependence, incompetence, and so on. They often come together. A child who is emotionally abandoned might also feel worthless and emotionally deprived. As Susan said, these are just guidelines to give you an idea of the possibilities. Once you've learned them, try to forget them and let the client lead the way. A client has to find their wounded part in the way they perceive it. It might start as something completely abstract, like a muddy monster in a lake, a Tasmanian devil, or a wild tiger. Soon enough, the perception can transform into something closer to reality, the reality they actually experienced. In therapy, the crucial distinction is between emotion and state. A client might say they feel sad, but what they're actually experiencing is the full state of abandonment. It's not just a feeling, it's a living memory. The exile is still trapped in the terror of that moment. The client isn't simply having an emotion, they are living in a state of being. They're experiencing a part of themselves that is still stuck in the original trauma, in the overwhelming moment when no one came, no one protected them, and no one soothed their fear. If you see them as they are, it becomes incredibly simple to explain many of the client's experiences and behaviors. Because once you see how they stem from that part, it becomes clear why they act as they act. In IFS, this is called burdens. That's why exiles are so frightening, not because of the pain itself, but because of what that pain represents. I often say, there's no real difference between an actual child and the inner child part. Both think, feel, and believe in the same way. But in therapy, we're typically dealing with a traumatized child part, one who carries what a person has endured. Activating that part can feel like unlocking an entirely new dimension. The client's carefully built, present-day life may suddenly feel dull, disconnected, or meaningless in comparison to the unlived intensity of that child. It's not just the terror that scares clients, it's the potential that part carries, and everything they might have loved, but had to push aside to adapt to the world. One whole unlived life. The sense that there is something in them that could remake their entire sense of self. That too is threatening, especially to the protective system that has kept that vulnerability buried for so long. In the third module, we'll explore why exiles are especially important in relation to resistance and how we can gently approach them to initiate recovery. By now, you may be wondering about firefighters, those urgent, disruptive, sometimes explosive parts that show up when everything else fails. In IFS, firefighters aren't considered stable, day-to-day parts of the system. They tend to emerge in moments of acute emotional crisis, when internal pressure becomes unbearable and protective managers can no longer contain the pain. I sometimes put it this way: just because we have defenses doesn't mean they're always successful. And when those defenses fail, when the house is on fire, the firefighters kick in. Some clients rarely encounter them, but others, particularly those with more chronic or severe trauma, live in a kind of internal war zone, where firefighters are constantly activated, fighting off distress through any means available. These parts can take many forms: suicidal ideation, binge eating, the urge to self-harm, frantically seeking company, and so on. Whatever takes the pain away. What distinguishes firefighters is not just their intensity, it's their reactivity. They're not planning or strategizing like manager parts. They're responding. They appear when the pain hits a boiling point. And once the crisis passes, they often disappear again. Still, in some clients, especially those living in constant overwhelm, firefighters become more stable. They're always active. A chronic impulse to use substances, to flee from the body, to numb out, or to disappear into fantasy can indicate a firefighter that has essentially become a regular part of the client's identity. In these cases, you may need to work with them in the same way you would any other protector. They are often perceived as evil, and they frequently take on forms that symbolically represent that perception. The question that sometimes arises here is, can someone be continually identified with a firefighter to the point that it crystallizes into a stable part of personality? I believe so, though in the general population you'll rarely encounter it. In these cases, what begins as an emergency coping response gradually hardens into an enduring stance, sustained by ongoing, never-ending emotional suffering that worsens with each cycle of addiction. Over time, the firefighter strategies stop being situational and instead shape identity itself. I would even hypothesize that this crystallization of firefighter energy into personality may be one factor in the fentanyl epidemic in the US. And while there are certainly biological and social causes, there must be a psychological dimension driving it. Now, the only thing that's missing is the self. The self is not just another part of the psyche. It's the very axis to which parts are attached. It's not the inner child, or the wise mind, or the grown-up ego. The self is something different. It's the place we come from when we're not blended with any part. It's the awareness that can see, feel, and relate without being pulled into reactivity. Some say the self is the space between parts. Others describe it as the whole. the container, the center, the witnessing presence. In IFS, we talk about self as a source of compassion. It's the quiet force that can hold even the most painful truths without flinching. It doesn't get overwhelmed or hijacked, because it doesn't fight the parts, it leads them. In the house analogy I use, the self isn't just a room. It's not even the foundation. The self is the entire house. It's the space in which all the rooms exist. It's the quiet structure that holds everything, the chaos and the calm, the protectors and the exiles, the wounds and the wisdom. Sometimes it's buried under decades of noise. Other times it peeks through the cracks. No matter how wounded the system, no matter how many protectors are online, or how thick the fog has become, the self remains. And with the right conditions, with safety, curiosity, and unblending, it begins to emerge. Not as a theory, not as a role, but as a felt experience that changes the entire therapeutic process. I've seen it happen again and again, and every time, it feels like a quiet miracle. The moment a client shifts, even slightly, from being inside a part to falling into the self. It's not something you become, it's something you uncover. That moment is the beginning of everything. In the third module, we'll explore how the self is the carrier of the therapeutic process, and how it can become the basis of a new identity.